Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Deltarune Theory. The most important Deltarune theory of all time! Why does Jockington grow a beard in the prophecy? And much like chair theory, for which you might not remember, but it was a theory I did before Chapter 3 and 4 released about the chair that ended up being in like the very first 5 minutes of Chapter 3 in Susie's room, where it would be. So I got that wrong, and more or less it was just for fun, because it was analyzing this tiny little detail and trying to figure out where it could be with other tiny little details within the world of Deltarune. So, don't take anything I say in this theory too seriously, but I do think there's some good narrative analysis in here that might help you in terms of not totally believing that Jockington is the main villain of Deltarune. So, let's talk about it. First off, why Jockington? This is something that's come up a lot recently, so this might be a time capsule for some of you if you're watching even like a couple months from when this video was posted. But right now, a big sort of joke theory in the Deltarune community is that Jockington is possessed by Friend, and one of the main reasons people have for putting up with this, much like Rules Night, is because Jockington seems weirdly important. Like, why is Jockington the only character to have his name in the prophecy? Like, Lancer doesn't have his name in the prophecy. He's just called the Pointy-Headed, right? The three main characters, Susie, Ralsei, and Chris, don't have their names in the prophecy. That could be maybe explained by the fact that there's some ambiguity towards who the, like, heroes actually are. But, like, the Dark World should know who Lancer is. And let's be clear, the Dark World is interpreting this prophecy. Everything in the Dark World is a reflection of something in the Light World, right? So we know that these prophecy panels are a reflection of something that actually exists in the church. And really, there's only like two options I can think of that really make sense. Either it's the stained glass windows, which depict moments from the prophecy, or it is the books that contain the prophecy itself. And I really think it has to be the books, because there are these lines from Caddy. Again, a very small detail, but she says, and there's one with like, horns? I was talking about Ralsei, but she doesn't know Ralsei's name because it's not in the prophecy. She's just talking about one of the three heroes. He's honestly so cute. I mean, there, like, aren't any pictures, but like... So that means the prophecy describes Ralsei, or somebody, it might not even be Ralsei, but assumedly Ralsei, as having horns, which is interesting because we don't see that in our prophecy panels at all. Anyway, she says there aren't any pictures in the prophecy that she read, which means the prophecy is text, which makes sense. That's the same as, you know, most religious texts. That's why they call them that. They're not like manga. However, the Dark World interprets these texts and gives them images. So the fact that Jockington's name is in there is even weirder, right? Does that mean that, like, when the prophecy was written by time and space, whoever knows how long ago within the time scale of Deltarune, the name Jockington was put in there? If it's part of the actual prophecy, I would say yes. However, now that we know what the prophecy panels probably are, what if this isn't part of the original prophecy? Because if the prophecy is just the writing within these books that is being sort of put forward as the representation of the prophecy in the Dark World, then what would happen if you wrote something yourself in there? Like a note of some kind, or maybe some graffiti, for example. Would that not also turn into a prophecy panel in the Dark World? This is all to say that perhaps a rabid Jockington fan wrote some Jockington fan fiction into one of these books that has become the displays of the prophecy in the Dark World, and now it has manifested as a prophecy panel in Chapter 4. And I think this theory could be even more sound because of the fact, and this could be anchoring bias because this was the first thing I thought about when I saw this image before the chapter's released. This Jockington looks so much like the cool S, quote unquote, which is on the right side of the screen right now. which is a very, very common graffiti, right? It's kind of maybe the first graffiti symbol that most people see and learn to draw, right? Because it's so simple. So Jockington being interpreted, or this graffiti rather, about Jockington being interpreted as a prophecy by the Dark World, and then the image resembling graffiti works really well with the idea that Darkners are based on sort of connotations around what they are. Otherwise, why not just draw Jockington normally? Like, you could make the argument that there's like a certain art style to the prophecy panels, and so Jockington is drawn in this angular way that makes him look like the cool S just because. But, you know, isn't it kind of interesting that these things sort of tie together? So, let's ask the question. What does Jockington grows the beard actually mean for Jockington? And all you Jockington fans out there. Well, I think we can actually get the answer if we examine Jockington's dialogue right before, it's after the church service, so it's not right before the Chapter 4 Dark World, but it sort of is. Jockington says, "For me, she covered in hair always. We do what the other can. This is talking about Caddy. So the two of them are inseparable. We've already known that. And for Jockington, Caddy has hair. Well, Jockington does all this stuff for her, and that's equal in Jockington's mind. But what if it wasn't? What if Caddy and Jockington stopped agreeing on things, or this sort of arrangement stopped happening? Perhaps Jockington would have to cover himself in hair by himself, his own way, by, growing a beard, maybe? Is that not crazy? I think that's pretty sound in terms of like what this prophecy is actually about, because obviously it's a joke, right? But that joke can still sort of imply something that might happen in the future. And given that Jockington and Caddy are already like not totally seeing on the same page when it comes to Susie and Chris, there's a scene in Chapter 4 where Caddy's parents are stuck in a tree, and essentially Susie tells Caddy that she's going over to Noelle's house, and Caddy gets extremely defensive, as she normally does about Noelle, and says that she's going to cast a terrible hex on Susie if she does anything bad. Jockington essentially casts a quote-unquote counter hex with his sports blessing, whatever that means, because, he respects Chris's game for befriending the scary bully in their class. So, they're already not totally seeing the same way about Susie and Chris. So if Caddy actually tries to sabotage like Noelle and Susie's date in some terrible way during the festival, which could happen, maybe that'll be the like last straw for Jockington, and the two of them will have like a quote unquote breakup, even though they're not, romantically together or anything. So, if that is true, that would mean the prophecy is true. If all of that doesn't happen, though, that would mean that this prophecy is false, right? Not all of that has to happen, but Jockington growing the beard has to happen at some point. And if it doesn't, then that could mean that some of the other prophecies that we saw in Chapter 4 are also false, right? They could also be additions written into the prophecy itself, in order to, torment the heroes. Like, if you think Carol's the knight, Carol would absolutely do that, right? And even if Des is the knight, Des, we kind of get the vibe that she used to be a troublemaker. So maybe this is her old graffiti coming back to haunt us. Like, who knows? But, okay, what if, third option, this graffiti is true, but it is graffiti, and by writing it within the book that became part of the prophecy, it is now a prophecy. Like, it now has to happen. That's like, well, it's a little crazy for one, because that means you could write anything in there and make it happen. But it does kind of tie into the themes that Chapter 4 establishes, especially Gerson, where Gerson says that Susie is going to write a better ending. If you can actually write truths into the prophecy and have them happen, then Susie can literally write a better ending. And it would make sense that Susie would have to be the one to do this. because, like, Ralsei can't write it, obviously, because he can't go to the light world. And Chris is on the side of the prophecy, so why would Chris ever, like, write a better ending, quote unquote? And I think it could tie in as well to Lord of the Hammer. I mentioned that the prophecy is probably some books inside the Church Dark World, but it could specifically be Lord of the Hammer, because Gerson implies it is, well, he straight up says, it is based on the prophecy. And it would then sort of tie together this hanging thread of Gerson never writing the final chapter to the book. He died before he could ever write it. So he wants Alvin to carry on writing it, but he also, I think, would be fine if Susie carried on and wrote the final chapter of Lord of the Hammer, right? And it would sort of tie together everything that we set up in chapter 4. So maybe Jockington Grows the Beard is actually a foreshadowing to the very final events of the game, but probably not. All right, I'll talk about Friend, I guess. I mean, when in Rome, right? So yes, there is a tweet from Temmie. I talked about it in the Night is Fear Part 2 as well to support my own theory, which states, a cat's tail is just a snake in disguise. Obviously, this was posted in 2018, which means it's before Deltarune came out. It's April 2018, I should be clear. So before October when Deltarune came out. So it is plausible that Temmie could be writing about something in Deltarune that Toby has told her. Or it could be about anything else. Or it could be about Deltarune, but not specifically be about Jockington. I already talked about, like I just said, something in the Night is Fear Part 2, which is a different interpretation of this tweet. But there's actually a lot of snake imagery in Deltarune Chapter 4 if you want to look into it. First is, of course, during the Titan fight, we have this snake enemy, which shows up in the battle box to attack us. And before it shows up, each of the Titans' attacks is sort of telegraphed by the battle dialogue. And the one for the snake says, the darkness gives a long gaze. It's slithered like a snake. So that's how we know this is definitely a snake, and it is related to darkness because of the Titan. There is also, and I missed this on my first playthrough, so this video has been useful for one thing anyway, to show me this. This sort of, well, I mean, it says prophecy, but it's just from one of the NPCs in Chapter 4, who, after you see Jockington's prophecy within Susie's Dark World, because you can actually find it in there by going the wrong way, this NPC says, before the clock strikes midnight, the shadow will grow. Oh, the shadow will grow. Serpentine! Even when the clock ran back, the shadow was growing. A patch of shadow slithering on, serpentine! So saith our ancestors. Crazy fellows the lot! And you could interpret this in a lot of crazy ways. Like, the clock strikes midnight, so is that like the end of Deltarune's story? Even when the clock ran back, is that potentially talking about the time loop that a lot of people have been speculating about in Deltarune for a long time? However, I think this is actually talking about Chapter 4 itself, which becomes a little more clear when you think about everything that goes in to like the soundtrack and everything like that. So before the clock strikes midnight, the shadow will grow. Oh, the shadow will grow serpentine. So once we close the first dark world in the foyer of Chapter 1, a song starts playing while we explore the light world version of the foyer. And it's called 12 a.m., so midnight. So before the clock strikes midnight, before we close the first fountain, the shadow will grow. So the shadow is growing within the first fountain. Even when the clock ran back, the shadow was growing. A patch of shadow slithering on, serpentine. Now, this could either refer to Susie's fountain, as in she's ran the clock back by trying to recreate like a time before midnight, right? Where they closed that dark fountain. Or it could relate to Chapter 3's fountain, where after being past midnight, quote unquote, the first fountain, we now return to it sort of because the third sanctuary is like based on, like the first was based on the third. So we've returned to the dream sort of. Either way, what this NPC is talking about is that the shadow has been growing regardless of what we do, right? Regardless of what fountain we're in, what we're creating, the shadow is growing. And Ralse even says, right before you fight the Titan, in a very ominous line that I don't think gets talked about enough for how kind of like foreshadowy it seems. When Susie asks, is the Titan here? Ralse says, it was always here. So the implication is that, you know, maybe this Darkner is talking about the Titan itself. As they're in the Dark World, it's been constantly growing. No matter whose Dark World it is, the Titan continues to grow on, which is interesting. And it's actually something we could pull out of this stupid Jockington's beard theory. But okay, there is a couple other parts of the theory I want to quickly touch on and give my thoughts. One of those is Jockington's speech degrading. Jockington being a goner is kind of crazy, but, you know, I wouldn't be so surprised. Like, he needs to have something going on with him. He's got a dialogue sprite. Caddy seems like she's going to be important. I mean, Chapter 5's theme seems to be jealousy, and if that doesn't describe Caddy, I don't know what does. So that sort of makes sense, but we still don't really get what Jockington's deal is. So if he ends up being sort of our way of understanding what goners actually are at some point, that's actually, you know, pretty plausible, I would say. However, I think his speech degrading could also be, and this is probably going to be a little bit more controversial because I don't think people are going to like this very much, just a result of all the time spent between chapter 2 and chapter 3 and 4, and even like from chapter 1. Characters do talk differently in chapter 1 than they do in chapter 3 and 4. This is just like, it's just true. Like, Jockington's obviously a very sort of extreme example of this, but overall the dialogue's got a lot more me, let's say. In chapter 1, all the dialogue was fairly standard unless the character was like explicitly really weird, like rules, right? Even somebody like Clover, who could have a bunch of weird quirks to their dialogue, really just says normal, like normally typed, perfectly spell checked dialogue, with 3 different heads talking at the same time, right? It's a gimmick, but it doesn't rely on the text being broken up. Whereas like with somebody like Jackenstein in chapter 4, right? The point of his text is explained through the sort of broken English he uses rather than, you know, something else, right? Some other kind of gimmick. So it could be possible that due to this change in writing style over the chapters, that Jockington has become more incomprehensible because his character was always sort of a heightened sort of parody of popular jocks in school, and it's just got to the point where now the parody is leaking into his text as well as what his text is actually saying, you know what I mean? But I think it definitely could actually mean something consequential for the world of Deltarune 2. I just want to, you know, if it doesn't end up meaning anything, I just want to sort of temper your expectations there. So yeah, I don't think Jockington's going to be like the host of Friend. I think if Friend is possessing somebody, which again is kind of funny that theory came out at the same time I was suggesting Friend is possessing somebody, just a different person. I don't think it's going to be Jockington. I just think there are so many more interesting options that having him possess Jockington would be a bit odd to choose, right? Because a lot of people bring up sort of the same situation kind of happening in Gravity Falls, where Bill Cipher possesses just some random guy, basically, like a side character from an episode a while ago, to trick the main characters, which, like, yes, but we already knew like Bill had possessed other people before that, right? So even if he's going to possess Jockington's not going to be the only one he possesses, probably, right? That's just what I'm trying to say. Anyway, you probably didn't need me to tell you all that. You probably already knew that Jockington isn't going to be the main villain of the game, but, you know, I felt like I had to talk about it, considering I just talked about Friend possessing people in a video not that long ago. Anyway, that's it. It's the end of the theory. We made it! So let me know what you think in the comments about Jockington and Caddy potentially having a friendship ended moment because of her sort of hatred towards Susie, and then Jockington has to grow his own hair. What you think about the idea that the prophecy can be changed by writing in the light world, so therefore Susie can finish Gerson's book and, you know, make the events of the prophecy be better. And yeah, I guess the whole thing about graffiti in general. That's really it. Thanks for watching. Bye.